in this show of Dollars and Cents, I'm going to finish up a subject that I began on the last show, where I was talking about a talk I had given at the Liberty Mastermind Symposium held in Las Vegas, February 21st and 22nd of this year. And it was called Countdown to Collapse. And I had given a background on a talk that I had presented 7 years before, where I had predicted a cataclysmic collapse was going to happen. And I also predicted other things that were at the end of the book that basically other people sort of dismissed, except a few people. And I'm going to talk about those today, because not only did the collapse happen, as I predicted it would, but it is in its latter stages, and the economic collapse is going to wipe away the world that we know, and we're familiar with it, and another world is going to come. And vis-a-vis this economic collapse, or this extraordinary change that's upon us, I want you to see it in terms of prediction and prophecy, because the line between the two, it exists, but is sort of smudged when you get down to it in certain people. Now, I had been studying the Great Depression for 10 years before I presented my 148-page paper at the Positive Reading Network in 2007. I was quite lucky that within months of my predicting such a thing in public, that it actually began to happen. Now, how I predicted that, I want to give you some background. The way I see it, how I came to know about these issues, started really in 1991. I was in my last years of a 10-year federal prison sentence. I was one of those hippie drug dealers that you read about. You don't read about them, not really. But I was in my last year of my sentence, and these words came to me. And I want to read them to you. They came, quote, out of the blue. I wasn't expecting them, but they were so significant, I wrote them down and I looked at them, and I was quite stunned by what they said. This is 1991 when I heard these words. In times of expansion, it is to the hare the prize goes. Quick, risk-taking, and bold, his qualities are exactly suited to the times. In periods of contraction, the tortoise is favored. Slow and conservative, quick only to retract his vulnerable head and neck, his is the wisest bet when the slow and sure is preferable to the quick and easy. Every so often, however, there comes a time when neither the hare nor the tortoise is the victor. This is when both the bear and the bull have been vanquished, when the pastures upon which the bull once grazed are long gone, and the bear's lair itself lies buried deep beneath the rubble of economic collapse. Every so often, however, there comes a time when neither the hare nor the tortoise is the victor. This is when both the bear and the bull have been vanquished, when the pastures upon which the bull once grazed are long gone, and the bear's lair itself lies buried deep beneath the rubble of economic collapse. This is the time of the vulture, for the vulture feeds neither upon the pastures of the bull nor the stored-up wealth of the bear. The vulture feeds instead upon the blind ignorance and denial of the ostrich. The time of the vulture is at hand. Those words came to me in 1991, and I wrote them down. At the time, there was no inkling that such a catastrophic event was going to happen. I didn't believe it, or I didn't disbelieve it. All I knew was those words had come to me, and I had written them down. Well, during the 1990s, I began studying the Great Depression. I turned to Martha and I said, why am I doing this? I had no idea, but nonetheless I did. And I think the difference between myself and most people who are looking at the Great Depression, I had no ideological axe to grind. Most people who come to the field of economics, like religion, have a point of view, and they're looking for evidence to support their point of view. And the evidence is ideological. According to economics, mainly, there's those on the left, the Keynesians, and then there are those on the right, the Friedmanites. And then there's that particular group that I found to have a particular affection for, was what is known as the Austrian School of Economics. And although many of the Austrian school like to identify with the right, They don't realize that they're coming from an entirely different place. That the left and the right ideologically are both promulgated by people, by Milton Friedman on the right and John Maynard Keynes on the left, and both were firm believers in paper money. In fact, of all the ones between Friedman and Keynes who are going to have the greatest effect on modern economics in our times, it wasn't Keynes, as those in the bloggers like to scream at and blame him for what was happening. It was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman had the most influence on Richard Nixon and his economic advisors when Nixon decided to shut the gold window in 1971. Friedman told him that by shutting the gold window, cutting the link between gold and fiat pay and money, that the free market would take care of the disparity in the printing of paper money. That if you printed far more money than you should have, your money would become worthless and go down in value. And in fact, the very opposite happened. The United States printed more money than any other country on the face of the earth. It had the largest negative trade balance soon after we went off the gold standard. And the opposite, in fact, had happened. The U.S. dollar just gained strength, gained strength, and gained strength. Neither the left nor the right was right about what was going to happen. My questions were rather pure. What caused the Great Depression? Why did it bring commerce to a virtual halt in the 1930s? And that's really what it was. And I had done some extensive reading and study on it, so by the time that the dot-com bubble burst in the year 2000, I already had a preformed opinion of what was going to happen next, and it truly did. By the time that Marshall convened the Positive Deviant Network in 2005, my opinions were pretty much solid. All right, and I had no audience. I mean, I had no voice. Marshall, my friend, was one of the few people I told about this, and I don't think he liked it because Marshall's an Aries and he has a very positive point of view. And what I was painting was a picture so bleak that the positivity of it was sort of escaped most people's grasp at the time. I, however, do have a very positive view of what's going to happen, but it's going to happen after the collapse. Most of the people out there, both on the left and the right, are merely trying to salvage the current economic paradigm. What I said at the conference in Las Vegas was I was going to predict what was going to happen. Just like I had predicted the collapse in 2007, I am now going to predict the world that is going to be here after the collapse, and I'm going to tell you why. In Las Vegas, I went over the work of 3 people that I wanted to bring to the fore. And the first one clearly falls in the world of prediction, not prophecy. It's an academic work by David Hackett Fisher. All right? He's a professor, and he had written a book called The Great Wave. And Professor Fisher had gone back through history and had shown that periods of stability, and he gave them names, like the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Victorian Stability. These were periods of relative stability and prosperity. But Professor Fisher had pointed out that each one of these periods had been interrupted by what he called great waves. Another term Professor Fisher used for these were price revolutions. And what he said was this: after these periods of stability and prosperity, epochs, what would arise what he called was a great wave. A great wave that at the end would have destroyed the present epoch and period, brought it to its knees. That what had started out as stability and prosperity would end up in economic calamity, institutional collapse, and a complete rendering of the previous epoch. And out of that rendering and collapse of the previous era, a new era would form. An era quite different than the preceding era, and an era of a higher quality and standard of living necessarily, or just different than the previous era. In other words, Fisher saw these as improvements. It was like how a snake sheds its skin, that the period of shedding it is cataclysmic, not pleasant perhaps to the snake. I don't think the snakes care, unlike us who do get attached to stability and prosperity. But these periods, these great waves, Fisher pointed out, happen intermittently, bringing the previous period to an economic standstill. All right? And these periods last between 80 and 160 years. These periods are often accompanied not only by economic uncertainty, but by calamities on a magnitude that we can't imagine. All right? The Great Wave between the period known as the Middle Ages or the Feudal Ages and the Renaissance was accompanied not only by economic uncertainty, collapse, and chaos, but by the Black Plague. The period between the Age of Enlightenment and the age of what he calls the Age of Victorian Stability, Fisher calls, was accompanied by the 100 Years' War. Total devastation. All right? Well, Fisher said that we are in another great wave whose amplitude of change is greater than any wave he has studied previously. So we are in the mother of great waves that is about to crest. And I want to read to you what Professor Fisher said is common to all such great waves. In each great wave, between each period, food and fuel led the upward movement. Manufactured goods and services lagged behind. These are prices. So food and fuel started going higher and higher and higher. Manufactured goods and services went higher too, but not at the rate of change of inflation that food and fuel did. These patterns indicated, according to Professor Fisher, that the prime mover was excess aggregate demand, generated by an acceleration of population growth or by rising living standards, or both. Eventually, in each great wave, prices went higher and higher and became increasingly unstable. They began to surge and decline in movements of increasing volatility. Severe price shocks were felt in commodity movements. The money supply was alternately expanded and contracted. Financial markets became unstable. Government spending grew faster than revenue, and public debt increased at a rapid rate. In every price revolution, the strongest nation states suffered severely from fiscal stresses. Spain in the 16th century, France in the 18th century, and the United States in the 20th century, in the present price revolution. Wages which at first kept up with prices now lag behind as the wave crest. Returns to labor declined while returns to land and capital increased. The rich grew richer. Inequalities of wealth and income increased. So did homelessness, hunger, crime, violence, drink, drugs, and family disruption. Great waves last between 80 and 160 years. The present great wave began in 1896 and is now cresting. Professor Fisher wrote in his book, that the amplitude of change in this current great wave is greater than in any previous wave, which could lead to my belief, I think it qualifies it, that what is going to happen to this is we're going to see change on a magnitude and on a level that we haven't seen before. Governments, institutions, religions, and cultures are going to be flattened when this great wave finally crests, as it always has, bringing the previous epoch to a complete end in almost complete devastation, out of which another era will arise. This fully falls in what I call into the area of prediction. This book, that The Great Wave, was written in 1996 and published by Oxford University Press. It is an academic work. I referenced it when I gave a talk in Munich. I was invited to speak there a couple of years ago by Professor Antal Fekete, a deep friend of Martha and mine. And I used this book, Fisher's book, and a book written by a friend of mine called Fiat Money, The History of Currency, written by a very, very good friend of ours, Ralph Foster. And at the talk in Munich, there was a sort of a hot dog of a student there. He's young, Austrian economist. He had gone both to the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Alabama and was a student of, at the London School of Economics in London. And he sat there with his computer taking notes on what I was what I was speaking about, and trying to reference my material to criticize my talk. I didn't mind this. If I was wrong, I wanted to know it. If it was just a point of view, I could handle that. I mean, after all, points of view are just points of view. This young man couldn't find any criticism of my point of view. And in fact, when he tried to turn down the interviews, my sources, he was found very little on the history of fiat money by Ralph Foster. And that's because the powers that be don't want you to know the history of fiat money. Its absence is there for a reason. And this is what I said in Las Vegas. And I said this in Munich too. That the information that you find on the internet and in your libraries is quite controlled by the powers that be. The internet is much harder to control, so what you're able to find on the internet doesn't always fit with the mind manipulation going on in the powers that be, who have a vested interest in the way things are. But nonetheless, David Hackett Fischer made these extraordinary predictions that we're in the middle of an extraordinary rendering of the present epoch in his book, The Great Wave, Price Revolutions in History. The next person I referenced in Las Vegas was Bucky Fuller. And my friend Marshall Thurber, who had put together the Positive Deviant Network, was a very, very close friend of Bucky in the latter part of his life. Marshall recognized Bucky for who he was, an extraordinary mind and heart, a rare combination in this world. People of heart don't always have the at least reputation in the field of intellect that their peers do. And in fact, if you do have a great heart, your reputation is invariably tarnished by those in the field of especially economics, who look with suspicion upon those who bring feeling and heart into the world of economics, what they consider hard science. It's not hard science, it's heartless science. It is a world of numbers without feeling, without compassion. And this is what basically part of the archetype that's falling apart and is in the process of being destroyed right now. That the scientists and the academicians in our schools, medicine, philosophy, economics, sociology, history, have studied their field and risen in the belief that their study without heart is a pure study. It's not. It's merely a more heartless study. And we're going to find out, and we're in the process of finding out, that the conclusions that these, quote, scientists have sought, blinding themselves in what they believe is a search for truth, they have only found their own truths, which are limited. Bucky Fuller was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And he predicted in 1981 in his book, The Critical Path, he said, mankind is entering upon a crisis, an unprecedented crisis. This is from The Critical Path. It is moving, humanity is moving ever deeper into crisis, a crisis without precedent. First, it is a crisis brought about by cosmic evolution, intent upon completely transforming humanity from a complex of competing, differently colored, differently credoed groups into an integrated, comprehensively inconsiderate, harmonious whole. This crisis is going to bring us together and result in a world of unprecedented prosperity. The foreword to what he had written in The Critical Path was called Twilight of the World's Power Structures. 10 years after Bucky wrote this book, the first world power structure collapsed, communism. 30 years after he penned these words, the primary power structure, capitalism, is also collapsing. And Bucky said, out of the collapse of these two power structures was going to arise a world far beyond our ability to even conceive of at this time. Bucky said that this great change is going to be triggered by the economic bankruptcy of the United States, the most powerful of the current sovereign states. And the bankruptcy of the United States, which looks like it's self-induced, and we have criticism of both on the left and the right pointing fingers at each other, saying that each side is responsible for the collapse of the whole. Bucky said, no, it's not true. That this economic collapse of the sovereign state of the United States, and of all sovereign states ultimately, not just the United States, which is going to result in a far better world, is what Bucky called a Class 1 event. Bucky separated events that cause changes on the planet Earth into Class 1 and Class 2. Bucky said Class 2 events were set in motion by man. All right. By man's attempts either for self-promotion, self-aggrandizement, or, quote, even to make things better for the collective humanity that were set in motion by man. He said these are Class 2 events. The collapse that we are involved in right now, the economic collapse of the magnitude that David Hackett Fisher pointed out in his book, The Great Wave, Bucky said was a Class 1 event, an event set in motion by the universe itself. Bucky used the word universe in the place of the word God because the word God is so loaded by the folks who have the power on this planet. They've distorted the purpose of the universe, applied it to their own situation, and said they are the beneficiaries of the universe, even though they don't believe in God, really beyond a lip service that they have. But generally, that the universe is moving at this time to bring the current power structures to its knees and to bring a higher level of living, of connectedness to each other that doesn't exist at this present time. Now, Bucky arrived at these conclusions because of something he had gone through. He had a spiritual experience, which basically brought him to his ability to prophesy. But in Las Vegas, I ended up with the prophecies of a person named Edgar Cayce. And I suggest for you, those of you who are listening to this, to Wikipedia Edgar Cayce. Because he said that we are moving into a period of ultimate collapse. I want to show you what it looks like right now. He said this period is going to be collapsed by earth changes, a series of catastrophic earth changes that are going to bring our planet to its knees. That graph started in 1900. When it started moving up was in 1945, when Cayce died. When it really started moving up was in 1965, and you see where it is now in the year 2009, 2010. These are the things that Edgar Cayce said was going to happen. It was not prediction. It was prophecy. Edgar Cayce was a psychic. He said these periods of earth changes were going to cleanse humanity and usher in a period of brotherly and sisterly love. This is what I spoke about in Las Vegas. And I told them that it's not going to be easy, but as I've always ended each one of my articles that I started writing in 2007 with the words, buy gold, buy silver, have faith. And of these three, faith is the hardest to come by. But in times of great change, it is what you're going to need most of all. Better times are coming. That transition is not going to be easy, but that doesn't mean it won't come. We're about to get our clock clean. A pendulum is in motion. And whether you experience that pendulum as a wrecking ball or as a pendulum is up to you. Hanging on to the old world is going to come at your own peril. Letting go will allow you to watch the changes and survive what is about to happen to us. We are at the edge of the greatest change that humanity has ever seen. The person who followed me, Greg Manarino, echoed these thoughts. And I was surprised that Greg had said it because they echoed my own beliefs, that mankind has not seen the changes that are about to happen. And usually we face the future of change with fear. My counsel to you is, don't fear. Watch it, accept it. The universe is moving. If you want to use that word, God, then do so.